Hello, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series Beyond COVID at the Center for International Development at Harvard. My name is Asim I Khwaja. I direct the center. And today I have the privilege of hosting and moderating the last of our series for this semester. It's my great privilege to introduce the guests on our panel today. But before I do that, just to introduce today's session. We've been talking about various aspects of how COVID has changed and affected us globally, particularly in emerging economies. And we've covered a range of topics from education to health, to industry, to the future of work, to the macroeconomy. And I thought it was appropriate to come back to health today, but also come back to health in a way that COVID may have displaced a lot of other health issues, a lot of diseases that may typically have been neglected, but due to COVID for several reasons may continue or have been exacerbated. And on my panel today, I have three experts who have thought and spent a lot of time thinking on those issues and thinking more globally on global health issues. I will introduce very briefly the panelists in order. And then we will jump straight into opening statements by all three panelists. First, we have Dr. Pedro Alonso. Dr. Pedro is the director of the World Health Organization Global Malaria Program and is someone who's thought a lot about that disease and how we are still not fully over it and still struggling with it. Second, we will have Dr. Silvia Gold, who's the president of Mundo Sano Foundation. Dr. Silvia has spent a lot of time worrying and thinking and helping address neglected diseases. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Silvia about her work. And then finally, I have my own colleague, Professor Michael Reich, who is the Taro Takemi Professor Emeritus in the Department of Global Public Health and Population at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And I've been reading some of Michael's recent work that he was very kind enough to share with me, also thinking through vaccination hesitancy, but also what the pandemic may have caused in terms of us not testing or looking after other parasitic infections as well. So I'm hoping to hear from Michael about that as well. So with that, let me open up to our panelists. Pedro, I'll start with you. And just as in the past, I've posed kind of three broad questions for the panelists, which is, how has the pandemic affected the context that you're in? Are there any signs for improvement in global health? Have we learned any lessons as a result of dealing with the pandemic? And perhaps most importantly, going forward, how do we think whether those lessons will stick, improve, stay, or will we sadly forget some of the things we learned? And so I want to turn to you, Pedro, first.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Honored to be here with you and share this panel with Professor Reich, with Dr. Gold, and all of you. My role for the past nearly 8 years has been to direct the Global Malaria Programme at WHO. That means the overall technical responsibility for the lead technical agency to fight malaria globally. For those that are not perhaps entirely up to date or informed about malaria, remains one of the major killers of young children, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, endemic in still 90 countries around the globe, killing in excess of 600,000 people every year, in excess of 200 million cases every year. Some people contain that or claim that malaria has been the largest killer in mankind's history. I'm not sure that that's true. But it just reflects that it's a long-standing pandemic, often affecting the poorest sectors of our global society, and with a stronghold in sub-Saharan Africa. We used to call it a poverty-related disease, a disease that is a cause and a consequence of poverty and that has impeded economic and social development in large parts of the world. So when in 2020, in January 2020, I happened to be in China because we were preparing the certification of China as malaria-free, as in Wuhan, the first cases of what ended up being termed COVID-19 were being identified and treated. And not because I am a visionary, which I'm not, or particularly bright at reading the future, but it became incredibly obvious as the information was evolving, and WHO called this a public health emergency of international concern at the end of January, which is the highest level of alert that the World Health Organization can issue according to the international health regulation. You cannot call out a bigger threat than what was done, if I recall rightly, was January the 30th by the Director General on the advice of all experts committees advising him. Our thoughts immediately, and at that time, by the way, there had only been, I think, less than 100 cases outside China and no deaths. But if this was going to evolve into a large-scale pandemic, as it did, it became very obvious that there was a fundamental risk, particularly in the lower sectors or the poorer sectors of our global community, for this to compound or affect the fight against malaria. And indeed, I believe the Malaria Programme was one of the first ones to get off the ground in trying to first understand what was happening. And this speaks to the fragility and as you were asking, what were the challenges, the weakness of the data. And that tortured us for months, just simply understanding what is going on. Are the countries being affected? Is there a relation between COVID-19 and malaria? What is the level of service disruption that is being caused by the disease? And that was, it always is a challenge to have good, accurate, timely data. In the case of COVID, I guess for pilots, it's the sense of flying blind. We didn't know what was happening, and it was really hard to get that sort of information. The second biggest challenge was very quickly, and I'm sure many of you remember, all the misinformation, the backbone of our basic science structures were challenged. And as you will recall, hydroxychloroquine suddenly became the wonder drug to treat COVID. Well, hydroxychloroquine happens to be and has been historically the backbone of treatment of malaria, and certainly in some parts of the world. And the shortages that led to, the challenges with supply chain, the rush to get hold of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine around the world was extraordinary. And I was saying this challenged the basic structures and modus operandi of science, was that there actually was no evidence that this really worked. And now we all love to be very much science-driven, data-driven, peer-reviewed journals and so on. Well, here was none of that happened, and still the medical community jumped at this, and countries just got hold of any stock they could actually get. So data, misinformation, challenges to the basic science structures, and effectively, indeed, the disruptions in supply chain and in health services performance. And we've estimated that although we mounted up what I'd like to think or believe was a pretty robust response in which we coordinated all partners, countries, to maintain essential health services and distribution of key commodities and to prevent and treat malaria, I think we were quite successful, and that's part of the positive lessons learned. But still, our estimates is that at least 60,000 extra deaths due to malaria, but associated with service disruptions linked to COVID-19 took place. Now, are there signs of hope? Always an optimistic person. Never before has health been so prominent on the global political agenda as now. And hardly surprising, because it did actually affect the wealthier North, if one can call it that way. So if there's a time when we don't need to go into complex, convoluted arguments to convince politicians that health is central to mankind, to human people's experience, and that, you know what, part of the poorer sectors of our society have lived for the last 10,000 years, not just with the pandemic of malaria, but the pandemic of tuberculosis, of HIV, of pneumonias, that continue to kill in a totally disproportionate and unacceptable way our most vulnerable population, and disrupting economic and social development. So having health up there on the agenda has been a positive. People now talk of resilient health services or health systems. I mean, Michael, Professor Reich will speak a lot. 2 years ago, no one knew when you talked about health systems, they said, well, what exactly is that? And if you added the word resilient, that sounds really odd. It must be some weird academic in Harvard making up this type of terms and so on. So I think that this has offered an enormous platform for us to position the health agenda at the center of the global political agenda. Now, moving forward, is this momentum going to be maintained? Are we going to effectively, as a global community, enact the type of changes that are required? Most importantly, indeed, support the development and sustaining of robust health systems in all countries? Are we going to reform our global health architecture to be better prepared and respond? Are we going to ensure that in future equitable responses are enacted? I'd love to be more optimistic, but at times it is hard to be optimistic. Being where I am, it is my duty to be optimistic. But just notice how, in the face of a terrible situation that we're seeing in Eastern Europe and the war in Ukraine, COVID-19 and health has again disappeared from the agenda. Do you see it in the newspapers anymore? Rarely. So I think memory is short, and times are short, and I think we are going to have a major challenge maintaining the lessons learned and the action that are required moving forward to remain high on the agenda and to be adequately funded. I think there is going to be a massive challenge to international cooperation and financial assistance, including in the sense in the field of health, as we move forward. So we need to be optimistic. We need to act. But I'm worried.
Pedro, thank you. I mean, there's a bunch of really interesting topics you touched on, both kind of, and I was, as you spoke, I was emotionally going in my own roller coaster in moments where I feel like there are lessons learned on data and the importance of data and resilient health systems. And as you said, never before have we politically paid so much attention to this. But I'm also really troubled by what you said, which is how quickly does it take for us to forget what has been the biggest natural disaster in the last century. And so perhaps I'm a bit optimistic that once the clouds of war are over, we will come back to this realization, but the jury is open on that. So let me turn, but I want to come back to several of the themes you've raised in our discussion amongst our group, because I think they're just fascinating. But let me turn over to Silvia.
Well, thank you, Asim. Pleasure to be with Dr. Alonso and Dr. Reich. And difficult to add something after Pedro. I think you make such a bright resume. So try to say something. If we think in the cost to other diseases outside COVID, I think the pandemic was tremendous because I think there was no disease. I think we cannot measure yet the real impact it had because it impacted everything. Hospitals collapsed, mean that people died of heart attacks, of strokes. Severe chronic disease were unattended because they need hospital support, and any illness was unattended. The lockout produced itself other diseases, mental health, the main, from anxiety, depression to suicides. We are all conscious that we have a serious problem of mental health now. Then we have the global lockout with problems of supply. Dr. Alonso mentioned them. Vaccinations, 2020, during the year 2020, at least 23 million children didn't receive the usual vaccines for any diseases that they used to receive. TB, tuberculosis, more than 1 million people didn't receive treatment. And today is the World Day of Tuberculosis. So we all are reading these numbers everywhere. So the global lockout was another cause. The self-economy, because there was no money for fund all the diseases, because COVID needed money and the economy went down. So it was, and moreover, this was uneven, the distribution of the impact. So inequity increased a lot. The numbers of poverty are tremendous. So the situation we have is really very deep crisis. I think we have to approach it. So some hope, yes, science, technology, industry were the surprise, the big impact, because we have so many different vaccines of different technologies approved in extraordinary times. We have so many diagnoses also of different technologies. So I think that industry, science first, and all this was perfect. And I think that digital technologies were also something very important, from virtual communication that helped so much in the lockout, to data, for instance, or apps, different apps. Data was also, it was incredible for all of us that we always need more data to see that all the data in the same way were everywhere, every day. Then we have to see what was the use of the data, what was the management of the information, but the data was there, and that was very, very important. So, and I think also, as Dr. Alonso said, that the awareness of public health was very important. Infectious diseases were out of the agenda before the pandemic. We only had chronic diseases, aging, there were no more infections. So I think that the impact of a virus in all the countries as it was changed the agenda completely. So we hope this will help in the future. So that will be part of the lessons. I agree that lessons are for the leaderships. Health is not a cost, it's an investment. The cost of non-prevention is incredible. So I think you, Pedro, said it so clearly. It's now we need to do this, but we are not sure that it will be done. We hope it will be, will work. We have to think again, because we had many lessons, but we are experts in rethinking. We thought that we had to rethink before COVID. So now more than ever, we think that we need to rethink. We don't want to go back to where we were. Even the high income countries were not prepared to reply to the pandemic. There was no preparedness at all. So I think that the concept of One Health that is growing, in which we believe for always, it's important, because I think there are things of management. You don't need a lot of money to think in One Health. That means animal health, human health, environment. It's coordination. I think we need coordination. We need partnership. I think cooperation was something also that we saw during the pandemic. So I hope we'll consolidate that. And I agree that we don't see any more about COVID, but I think that public health should be in the mind of all the authorities, and we'll work for that, as always.
Yeah, thank you. Again, several common themes are coming up, and just to reiterate the idea of health systems, One Health, the importance of data, but also kind of this caution and the excitement of what science and perhaps industry was able to achieve, but at the same time, the cautionary note about, will this attention stick? And so I'd love to come back again in our discussion. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Asim, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel with my, distinguished colleagues and good friends. I also wanted to take this opportunity to publicly thank Pedro for his 8 years of service as head of the Global Malaria Programme at WHO. He has one more week. Pedro, you've got one more week to solve the world's malaria problem, so hurry up.
That's easy.
And Silvia, thank you for your leadership at the Fundación Mundo Sano. You do so much to work on neglected tropical diseases around the world. And thank you, Asim, for your 3 questions. I think about the pandemic as a kind of 2-year global course in public health. And it's been a long 2 years, and it's been a difficult course. And we're still in the midst of the final exam. And it's not clear that we're going to pass. And it's not clear yet what the lessons are. It really has been, as Pedro said, it's put public health on political agendas, and it's taught political leaders about public health. Let me go to your questions, Asim. First, you said, well, what's the biggest challenge that comes from the pandemic? For me, the biggest challenge is selecting the biggest challenge. There's so many challenges that the pandemic has highlighted. Let me start with one that's close, that I think everyone feels in public health, and that is the lack of training for epidemiologists on how to speak to the public. Public communication about public health problems, and especially about talking about uncertainty. We've seen some people in the US context who've done a good job, but if we think back to the beginning of the pandemic, it seemed like another world when we still had Trump as president. The public communication was a disaster. And I think there were similarly problems at WHO. So that's the first point. The second challenge, biggest challenge for me, is the maldistribution of global resources. We've seen this for vaccines. We've seen it for monoclonal antibody treatments. We've seen it for production of vaccines. We've seen it for patents. We've seen it for the wonderful drugs that have been produced so quickly. And it's the weaknesses of those institutions that were created to promote redistribution. I think there's going to be some critical thinking about COVAX, for example, and why there still are low levels of vaccination within Africa. The third biggest challenge for me, I think, is actually the nature of vaccines and the way that the pandemic has raised around the world in many different settings negative reactions, resistance, skepticism, active denial about vaccines. You know, vaccines are a funny technology. It's something foreign that you take into your body to get your body to produce defenses for a threat that may happen in the future that you can't see. And I think that these social reactions to vaccines appear in different ways in different countries, but they have a long psychological and historical and social roots. I did an article, as you mentioned, Asim, with Professor Andrew Gordon, a historian at Harvard, on Japan, and we looked at 150 years of social responses to vaccines. And this kind of negative reaction goes back to the first introduction of vaccines, the Jennerian vaccine against smallpox in the mid-1800s. So I think understanding how to talk about vaccines to people in ways that they can understand and accept them. And again, it has to do with questions of risk. The fourth biggest challenge has already been mentioned, and I think that the biggest challenge for me is that somehow, as COVID has started to seem to decline, we've returned to war in Europe with tanks in streets, bombardment of civilians and cities, just scenes that were appearing 70 years ago in World War II. It's just incredible, and in some ways, this is a failure of global institutions, and raising questions of even more dramatic failures in terms of chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare. So, are there any signs of hope? I think one of the best signs of hope is something that Silvia mentioned and that Pedro has participated in, and that is the opportunities for rethinking other public health problems. And I've engaged in an effort on rethinking malaria, organized by Professor Diane Worth at Harvard and done in collaboration with WHO in Geneva, and with scholars, especially in Africa, researchers, and it's really to bring in new thinkers to reflect on the pandemic and say, what have we learned that can be used to solve these age-old problems around questions of governance, around questions of service delivery, around questions of human capacity and learning. The other example of a sign of hope is that I think that actually the pandemic has had an impact on political leaders and political thinking. Different ways in different countries, but it has said, infectious diseases matter and they have to be addressed. The new vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, have been incredible. And here's, technology can help. And the treatments that have been rapidly developed, I have friends who've taken them. So again, technology can provide solutions in some ways, in some timeframes. And one example of a change in thinking was Japan's decision to promote the HPV vaccine after having it unofficially recommended and almost went from 70% usage to 1% usage. At the end of last year, they agreed to start the active recommendation again, and they will reintroduce it. I think that's reflecting a rethinking about vaccines among political leaders. So your third question is, how do we take these lessons forward? I think that I think we need better institutions for doing active learning with practitioners about public health crises, and that really brings together public policy, public health, and political leadership. And I think that it has to be in settings that allow critical thinking, critical reflections, and ways to rethink old problems. So those are my comments, and thank you, Asim.
Thank you, Michael. That was just fascinating. It resonated a lot personally with me and my own experience, especially on being at the Kennedy School, communicating to public leaders. Matt Andrews, who's a colleague of mine who leads a group called Building State Capabilities, has thought a lot about kind of leaders in crises and communicating with leaders in crises and how leaders should communicate to others in crises and how difficult that is. So I think that's like, and also I think the second part on this idea of active learning. What does it mean to have an active learning mindset? In my own challenges, I was doing a lot of work in Pakistan when COVID hit, and getting leaders to realize that when you're collecting information, and I think Pedro and Silvia alluded to this as well, or even thinking of testing not just as a treatment, a pre-treatment screener, but as a way of thinking through where should I be putting resources in. So that requires a really decision-making under uncertainty mindset and thinking through, I can gather information not just for treatment, but I'm gathering information to tell me what my future profile of a disease could look like, which will then inform what my policy levers could be, from partial shutdowns or lockdowns to treatment regimes. But just that mindset getting through was interesting to watch. In some places it evolved phenomenally, in others it just did not. And I think you've raised several questions. So there's just a wealth of content that our three panelists have raised. Let me pause a couple of questions, not to be overly provocative, but I'm struck by both of what you're saying, and I'm struggling with which one of those two. There's several dichotomies in what we're saying, and I wanted to bring them to the table, and I want to come back to all of us and respond. The first is this the era of science? Is this the rise of science? In many ways, science has done miracles in a short time, as Silvia said. Or, as Michael also raises, is this the fall of science in terms of how people are reacting against vaccines? Have we embedded, are we winning the psychological war on science for the average public, or are we losing that war? Not to use war too much, given what Michael also reminded us is happening elsewhere in the world. But I want to pose this back to my panelists, and maybe let me start in the same order, but then people can jump in. So I'm going to start, Pedro, with you. Are you seeing this as success for science, or are you really worried about how the world is going to view science?
I think it's hard to argue that it is not the success of science. It is not the first time. The first vaccine developed by Jenner in 1796 was first disseminated around the world within 7 years of the initial observation of Jenner. That was not instrumental, but indeed smallpox has been the first disease that has been entirely eradicated from the world. In other words, there is no more smallpox to be found, except in a couple of labs, but there is no smallpox. So science has already in the past shown its power. Smallpox was a huge cause of disease and death, and science and public health has had the capacity to actually wipe it out, make the genome of that virus disappear from nature. And we are pretty close to doing it with polio, which 20 years ago still affected 300,000 people every year. And now we're probably talking of 10, 12 cases. I think the last count, I think, was 13 or 14 cases. We're just 1 mile away from another massive success of making polio disappear from the world. Now, what is extraordinary with what has happened with COVID is I think both Michael and Silvia have alluded to this, is the speed of the reaction. that within 10 months, we've had several vaccines developed, tested, and approved by regulatory bodies, and often using a technology, in this case mRNA, that had really been thought of and was being used for cancer vaccines and are being applied to infectious diseases. Now, that is pretty extraordinary. And I think it opens up a whole new avenue for vaccine development to address other diseases that are up to now not adequately prevented, including tuberculosis, including HIV, including second generation malaria vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's the triumph of science. Now, what we have is a secondary effect, which is, and I know Michael has been thinking a lot more about this, but I've been just deeply surprised outside of my workspace in social interactions, coming across extraordinarily well-informed, traveled, educated people who mix vaccine hesitancy with conspiracy theories, with hardline political positions. So it's not against science. It's a confounded effect of lack of trust and happiness. So yes, it's the triumph of science, but we have a massive communication problem out there. But that is, I don't think it's specific of science itself. I don't know if Michael would agree with that.
Michael, you want to respond? So is science good, but scientists are not trustworthy? What's going on over here?
I'm happy to let Silvia go first. Silvia, did you? I, of course, have.
Thank you. No, I agree with the last comment of Pedro. I think that the fight is not against science. I think this is a modality that we have now in all the societies, unfortunately, and people are against or pro or against, and the society, if you are not with, you are against, and this is a war. So I think there were people against the use of masks, there were people against the lockout. So without any reason, there is a fanatism and everything is a war. So I think that the science is in a good moment. I think that and I think that there is something that I find important in science. There was always a discussion if science should be basic science, should be applied science. I think that science is good or not. And I think that each time more, everybody's understanding that cooperation brings science to the service of the mankind. So people that only are interested in a question, and that's valid, and there are people that trying to use it, and it's also valid. So I think science is in a good moment, and I don't think the enemy is science. If you see, the use is freedom. People want freedom. People don't want to be vaccinated because they want their decision. So I don't think it's a scientific matter, or that the reply can be scientific, because they won't hear it. You can argument with any explanation. There is no reason. It's freedom, rights to. So it's. I think it's a manipulation of the information, and unfortunately, I think it's for not only for vaccines, it's for everything. For another comment, the speed that was important, something I wanted to say before. I think the emergency use, the authorities approving by emergency use, help a lot to the speed, and I think it's something that may stay for some. I mean, if you are sure of quality and you are sure of safety, what's an emergency? Malaria is not an emergency. What are the diseases that are emergency? So I think that some flexibility in helping for fastest approvals may be interesting in the future. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Silvia. So these are deep questions, Asim. And you know,
I asked the easiest ones to you, Michael.
My first reaction to your question was, you know, what does Asim mean by science? You know, what is in Asim's head when he says the word science? And I think we've had, you know, part of the failure of our public health course during the pandemic has really to have a good public understanding of what science is, and the confusion of science with, you know, what's behind me over here, with the idea of veritas as truth. Science and truth are not the same thing, and I think so. And I think that that's particularly true in the polarized political context that we find in every country around the world, and the extreme distortion that occurs through social media, which increases the speed at which misconceptions get accepted by significant groups of people. I think that complicates the question of communicating scientific uncertainty in a crisis situation when you have polarized notions of politics and polarized notions of truth. So, you know, Asim, in addition to your colleague, Matt Andrews, who I think does great work around helping decision makers understand data and dealing with crisis. There's also Sheila Jasanoff, who recently at the Kennedy School got the Holberg Prize, a friend for many years, who works on, and it's interesting, her field is science, technology, and science. So it's really the way in which society interacts and the law interacts with science and technology. And here, Silvia, I think it's a wonderful example, the conflict around masks and the confusion around masks that persists in all the world as a very simple technology that started 100 years ago in the Spanish flu. Excuse me for mentioning the name of that disease, Pedro.
Totally fine, especially because it was in Spanish, actually.
It wasn't.
Exactly. But, you know, I think what you mentioned in your recent comments, Pedro, I think is the question of trust. And for me, I have come repeatedly to say that I think one of the most under-taught concepts in schools of public health is the question of trust, both how to create it, how it occurs, how it's destroyed. When trust, and as you said, it's not just trust in science, it's trust in institutions, social institutions, trust in experts. You know, how do you create trust? How much uncertainty do you convey about something? Or do you only convey what you are nearly 100% sure about when you're talking to the public? So I think there's a lot of confusion, lack of expertise around the concept of trust in public health and schools of public policy on how to deal with it in practical terms. And for me, again, that's one of the big lessons of the pandemic.
If I may, Asim.
Please go ahead.
Because I think these are all such important concepts that both Silvia and Michael have brought forward. And I was just making this triangle between truth, trust, and uncertainty. I was drawing here, because that really goes to the heart of the matter. So, and linked to science. So in science, we never define truth. We never demonstrate anything. We generate evidence for or against a given hypothesis, and then we use statistical methods to assess what is the probability that that falls in the right place or not. So scientists are always managing uncertainty. But it is true what Michael says, we are probably not terribly good at communicating that what we're dealing is with uncertainty. And perhaps we communicate in a very forceful way, as if there was an absolute truth, and then it happens not to be the case, and then mistrust gets generated. So the link between science and what science is about, the management of uncertainty, and how this gets communicated in the dichotomy that generates trust from truth, I think are really important questions.
So it's really interesting, Pedro. I think that what gets lost is probabilities.
Yeah.
Science is about probabilities. It's likelihoods that this describes what is going on, our best understanding. And I think often, I'm an editor of a journal, I read papers where the notion of probability gets left out in the conclusion. And I think the same concept occurs when scientists speak to the public. And some scientists are better at that. Maybe Tony Fauci is better at that. But it's a very difficult skill that I don't think is well taught. I don't know what you think, Asim.
No, I agree. I mean, to me, the example in the pandemic was when we first did flattening the curve. Like, that's the first time I've ever seen a distribution get so popular and people getting excited about understanding distributions. But to your point, Michael, there was no standard error to that distribution. There was no variance to that distribution. There was no sense in which, and I remember getting pushback from a lot of policymakers who were like, well, is this going to happen for sure? Once we lock down and incur this massive cost, is everything going to drop? And when in reality, it didn't in many places. Suddenly, this very basic stylized picture that every television show, every news show showed became questionable. And I wish, Michael, to your point, we had demonstrated that by saying, look, this is the best projection we can make with a calibration which has a skewed standard error estimated of a different illness. But it seems, I think what we're all struggling with is, as a social scientist, I think a lot about this question as well. I'm in far muddier space than many of you are. But this idea of how do you communicate uncertainty while still giving confidence, while still not looking like you're ignorant. Like, it's not that uncertainty is the same thing as ignorance. It's not that, and to Pedro, your point, to trust the system, to say, yes, we're working under uncertainty, but what we're doing is the most expected, in terms of expectation, the most likely thing to succeed, given tough choices we're making. That balance, Michael, when you talk about teaching, how do we convey that balance, Michael?
So I think actually it has to do with some fundamental questions about, especially public institutions, transparency and accountability. So, how transparent are public officials about the uncertainty of their decisions? And there's a reluctance to be uncertain or there's a reluctance to take decisions that have risk because of a fear of future accountability. And so it's, on the other hand, you want institutions and individuals to be held accountable for their actions. A very concrete example of this, I have an editorial coming out in the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene about the Centers for Disease Control. They suspended the testing for parasitic diseases in September of last year for a whole series of them, 25, and they said it will be back soon. There was never, and there still has not been, a clear explanation of why. It's still not clear which ones, some of them have come back, but most of them have not. It's not clear when they'll come back. And I said to them in a conversation, I said, look, just give us an idea, a probability. These 3 or these 5, we hope to have back in the next month. Then after that will be these 5. And it's been difficult to get them to do that. Sorry, Silvia.
No, this is something we share, so we know both this history of parasites. But I think this is a lesson to learn because what's the solution? You want the explanation, but I want also the solution, and you also. So I think the solution is to finish with the centralization, because I understand that CDC is collapsed after COVID. I think that's the explanation. But why everything in a huge country like America has to be confirmed in CDC when you have hundreds of labs prepared to do a confirmatory test? So this is politics again. So this is rules. It's easy to solve if you,
So I want to take a, sorry, go ahead, please, Silvia.
No, it's management.
I want to link this to something you all have said, and I want to take Silvia's comment further, which is this a failure of global coordination? I don't know, yes or no, you can tell me. But if it is, do we need global coordination of the centralized kind, or can we have decentralized global coordination? Can we have actors? And the CDC example, Silvia, you gave is one illustration of that. Can we have collective action coming not from one person deciding or a few institutions deciding, but from the tens of thousands? Michael, you mentioned what about global inequity, which is just massive, right? Is that a unrealistic world to expect coordination happening in a decentralized way, or which way should we go? Fix global institutions or just give up on them? I'm going to start with Pedro this time, because I'm going to put Pedro. Pedro, you have a week left, so I feel you should go ahead and say what you want now.
I probably should speak out louder in a week's time, but no. It's an important question. It's not a straightforward answer, and I'm sure there are plenty of arguments for and against fixing global institutions. Is our global health architecture fit for purpose? No. Is it adequately funded? No. Is it adequately structured and deployed? No. Is the answer to reform it? My sense would be yes. Is it a dichotomy as you presented? I would say no. I think the emergence and the buildup of regional and national institutions, and the most obvious example has been in recent times the Africa CDC. I think these are really important and great initiatives. Is that I would think it's a false dichotomy. It's either the Africa CDC or WHO. No, it's both. Because the mandates are different. The coordination mechanisms would be different. Problem here is that there are some regional associations and countries that would not trust a global centralized health architecture, because they feel that global health or components of global health become a national security question, and therefore they're not ready to give up on a given leadership to manage that risk. So the debate is on the table. The solutions could be multiple, but I think that it is going to be an extremely important conversation, and depending how well that is managed and what the results are, it will determine to a large degree what our future looks like. But in summary to your question, current structures which were developed, I mean, in the case of WHO after the end of World War II, are no longer fit for purpose. They need a substantial reform. They're heavily underfunded. You mentioned the US CDC. WHO, which covers 192 countries, their budget is substantially lower on an annual basis than that of the US CDC. It's a heavily underfunded organization with a wide mandate, but without the tools to actually be able to perform its tasks. So I think we're talking on a really important discussion, and with pros and cons.
Let me get Silvia, and I want to then come back to Michael still to respond to one aspect of this. So Pedro suggests there's a complementarity between global institutions and regional institutions. I want to bring in Silvia, the private sector and civil society. How do you see, are they going to complement this centralized structure in some grand cohesion, or are they going to be at odds with each other?
I think also there is need and place for both. I think that the big global institutions have a role of guidelines that are important and technical guidelines, but I think that changes are easier in smaller in the field, because they depend a lot of leadership, they depend a lot, big changes are very difficult in huge scale. Times are short for political leaders. In a small place, you can make changes. And today you have networks to work together, different local. We believe a lot in the municipal changes where people are close with their leaders and where you have a cooperation with the private sector. We did an experience in COVID in a small municipality where we had an opportunity because one of our doctors was health authority in the place. It's a municipality of 25,000 people. And we decided to do an approach to COVID as we thought it should. We ignore the guidelines of the Ministry of Health. Anyone that has symptoms was suspicious. We trace everybody. We do screening. We do it as the epidemiology book. And we have excellent results that we are very happy because they were validated by PAHO. And we think it's a good model of cooperation because it was an agreement between us, private society, a municipality, and the University of Buenos Aires. The university did all the test, the PCR, in less than 24 hours. We had all the results when the official results were 10 days. So it was a good example of how useful was the cooperation and how happy they all were. And we think we'll continue scaling other programs because it was impressive how it was a place where primary health give better results than the years before. For instance, there were better numbers of children vaccinated because as everything was supported by primary health, it improved. So it was really, it's a pilot, a proof of concept, but I think it shows cooperation with private sector. And this is in small scales. This cannot be in global scale. So I think both are needed.
Michael?
So let me suggest some general principles, Asim. I think that what's needed in thinking about these global systems is central leadership and central guidance, as both Pedro and Silvia suggested, and a capacity for self-correction when the leadership and the guidance are not correct. And I think that's the fundamental issue in terms of WHO reform is the challenges of changing a bureaucracy that has very strong roots. The second thing is that has to be combined with flexibility that allows the decentralized units to make their own decisions with building up their capacity to actually make their decisions. And this is true both at a global level, it's true also within nations that are federal states, India, Brazil, Mexico, the United States. And one of the big problems is the lack of capacity in the subnational units. Let me suggest two really kind of institutional challenges that go with this. The first is institutions for redistribution. And I think here again, the COVID has shown the challenges of actually building up institutions for public health within African countries, within low-income countries during the pandemic. Commodities were shipped and they sat there and they had no idea what to do with them, or didn't have the capacity to distribute them. And again, COVAX and the lack of vaccination in low-income countries. The second institutional challenge is, as Silvia mentioned, networks for cross-learning among the decentralized units. You know, how does Argentina learn from Chile, learn from Bolivia, or how do the states within India learn effectively about how they're dealing with things? And those network-based mechanisms for learning are not adequately developed. So decentralization alone is not enough. There has to be redistribution, there has to be capacity building, and there have to be mechanisms for helping the people in the decentralized units learn how to do better.
In many ways, Michael, those are the tasks that the central actor could do. That's kind of...
If they can let go of a kind of command and control, we know what you should do, and here it is, yes. Go ahead, guys, just listen to us.
Yes. And is that embedded in their psyche, Michael, or is that?
Well, Pedro can speak about that in a week or so. But it's hard to be both at the center and to promote innovation by the decentralized units.
I mean, I can speak even today. I mean, the two cultures coexist within this type of institutions, including WHO. I mean, there is the command and control, which often is ineffective because, frankly speaking, the tools are not there. And there are those, in which I include myself, and that's been a lot of the work I've been doing over the past few years in terms of changing the paradigm of malaria control, in which the broad guidelines, which are evidence-based, following a detailed process of knowledge management and guideline development, says what are the type of things that you would want to do to control malaria, different tools. But it is up to the national and subnational level that Michael was saying of what are the right mixes of interventions that you want to do and how do you adapt them to your local context? Because you, at the subnational level, are the ones that know best all those contextual factors that determine critically the combinations or the effectiveness or the cost effectiveness of the different tools and approaches. So again, these things can be combined, but it's about how do you coordinate the central level and its function with the effective implementation and development of power and capacities at the subnational, national and subnational level to actually do smart public health, which in many ways is what Silvia was giving us an example of what is smart public health.
Let me, I wish we could keep going. We're fast running out of time. Let me pose a couple of questions from the audience. I'll just moderate them because it'll be easier. Hisham Ghaffar from Cairo, I think he's a WHO consultant, asks, all participants have mentioned the short attention span of public governments and donors. How do providers and health decision makers coordinate and work together instead of competing for this attention or resources? How do we shift from a zero-sum game of resources to leveraging these resources for system strengthening across health sectors? So how do we from zero-sum to positive-sum thinking in these I don't know if anyone wants to take that on.
This is a hard one. I would leave it for Silvia or Michael.
Michael wanted first.
You know, I would say just briefly that crises are opportunities for producing change. And in that sense, the pandemic is an opportunity for trying to give more attention to critical health system issues, and that and the way of working together is to reach out, create coalitions, create alliances, and find pressure points where you can actually make incremental or more than incremental changes that have tangible benefits for populations.
Silvia, as you answer, can I add one question that's directed towards you as well as you respond to the second one?
Okay.
Let me just read that out too. There's a question about Mundo Sano and your focus on neglected infectious diseases. And the question is, you've been working closely with local governments and researchers in Argentina to contain the negative impacts of the disease. What are some lessons from this experience, and how do you think they'll affect future collaborations in science? How do we create partnerships, the One Health kind of partnerships you were saying? So as you respond to the first question, if you could just have a quick response to the second one as well.
Yes. The second question first. We work in public health. Okay, you asked the other first, sorry. I think that what we have to look is for synergy, and the way to look for synergy is to have primary health as the first priority. So I think if we think in primary health and everything, because if we don't have health system, we don't have public health. So we need health system, and health system means, for me, primary health as the first step. Without it, we have no public health. So that's my understanding. And our work with authorities in Argentina, not only in Argentina, we have always work in cooperation with authorities, because work in public health, you need to work together with the health system. And our experience was excellent, because we always thank the opportunity of cooperating, because we like public health, but we know we cannot change public health. We can make a contribution to those that really can change it. So our understanding is, our contribution is to research in the field, to produce evidence that can help for better public health policies. So we work together. We had changes of ministries, of governments. We always work with the technical people, and we had always the doors open. So in local level, national level, we work very well. It's always a problem of trust. I think trust is key for everything, as Michael and Pedro were saying, is working together with trust, with respect, and in terms of cooperation.
Pedro, a question to you. Kao Kang from Myanmar is asking this question. They're asking a question about cost-effective ways of dealing with other infections, but also kind of related to that, this momentum and focus on data and public health. And so if you could respond to, like, if we want to be more cost-effective in how we respond to these new and existing diseases, what do you think we are learning from new data awareness or technology that can be deployed to make this a more cost-effective response?
Yeah, I must confess, I have some trouble, and I guess I shouldn't, but I do have some trouble with the concept of cost effectiveness. I think it's a term that is often used and thrown at you to justify we're doing this and we're doing that because it's cost effective or more cost effective. Honestly, in global health, we have limited quality data, and often on cost effectiveness, and often not adapted to different contexts. It's not the same, the cost effectiveness of intervention X in Northeast Nigeria than it would be in Myanmar, just to put an example. So when I hear about cost effectiveness, what exactly do we mean, and what are we going to use that ratio for? Number one. Number two, I guess the question is much more implying, how can we make our investments in health and in global health and in preparedness and in public health capacity and in health systems resilience, be it of a sufficient magnitude to assure or potentially assure an adequate outcome for the next pandemic or whatever. And again, I think that will be country-based and region-based. There is no one such thing as a figure that will tell you this is the best investment or the best return on investment, which is the other type of parameter that is often quoted. I think at national, subnational level, even regional, those are decisions that are very much country-based. At global level, it's where the question comes, let us first design what is it that the global health architecture should look like to be fit for purpose, and then let us see how much does it actually cost. But I wouldn't really bring the cost effectiveness concept into the discussion.
Makes sense. We have a minute left. I want to give the floor back to you guys and just say, for our audience who've been listening patiently and for our virtual audience and recorded audience, any last words of wisdom, I mean, from you guys? So I'm just going to go around the circle and I'll go in reverse order. Michael, you're up first. 30 seconds worth of wisdom. Maybe it's not possible, but.
So let me say that I think we need better institutions for learning from crisis. And I think that it's practical learning. And with regard to Pedro's criticism of cost effectiveness, I would just say that, I am not an economist, but I would say that I think it reflects a need for greater attention to questions of ethics and values in public health.
Thanks, Michael. Silvia?
Well, really to thank you for this panel. I enjoy it very much. I think that many times we said, what a complex question. So I think these are complex problems and we need many of these opportunities of thinking together, of learning together, and thank you for the opportunity. So I really enjoy it.
Pedro?
I add my voice to that of Silvia and thanking you for this exciting and discussion. There have been so many important concepts that have been laid out. Perhaps we haven't paid sufficient attention to, because it's been rightly so, very focused around COVID, but it's about equity. We still have differentials of 25, 30 years in differential life expectancy between some parts of the world and others. That is an ongoing COVID pandemic that has lasted far too long. We need to resolve the problem of inequity, of the basic questions of that the place where you're born depends on your chances of having a healthy, fruitful living. Health technologies and science are going to be critical tools, not just by themselves at all, but they are going to be critical tools that could allow us the opportunity to partly reduce that unacceptable gap. And trust in science, trust in public health, in an enlightened public health system are also going to be essential. So thanks.
Well, you know, the greatest gift one can ever give anyone is their gift of time. You have very generously shared your time with us. Our audience has shared their time with us. So thank you so much. I look forward to more of these conversations, but most importantly, I look forward to a more equitable world.